This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm really interested in trying to understand this, but I have yet to hear a substantive argument against just a clear, simple humanitarian exemption. The most I've heard is people say, well, the government wasn't going to do that. But Ms. Davis, you I think on the panel expressed the view that exemption, in your view, would not be a good idea. Could you give us your thoughts specifically on why?
Yeah, so what my research shows and what I've done in practice demonstrates that terrorist groups around the world raise money from a variety of different activities, but one of the ways that they do that is by taxing aid organizations that operate in their area. That could look like, acquiring resources from them. It could look like actually taking a certain percentage of the money that comes into the country. So part of my concern with not having a broad humanitarian exemption here is a complete inability to calibrate that. So we don't have the ability to help aid organizations, for instance, prevent that from happening. We don't have a way to understand how much money or how many resources are actually going to terrorist organizations when they operate. Yeah.
And because of time, and I'm interested in hearing more from you on this, could we not prescribe as part of that exemption certain kinds of calibration, like under these circumstances you can, and under, if you're being charged an effective tax rate over such and such, you can't? Like, could we not have just whatever the rules should be? Could we not establish those rules in law rather than it being based on a potentially shifting and inconsistent authorization regime?
You could technically do that, but the problem with terrorist organizations is that they do change those rules quite often. So it's really difficult to know if in one situation is it going to be 20%, in another situation is it going to be 60%, 5%. So they really shift around quite a lot, and every situation is really different as well. So 20% might be really important in Somalia, 5% might be important in Afghanistan.
Right, okay. It seems that you could still have, in a flexible way, some of those things defined in regulation, but still working from the principle of broader inclusion rather than individual authorization.
I think it makes sense in regulation, but maybe not in the legislation itself, because the regulations would be easily updated. Okay.
Both you and Ms. West referenced other countries that would be captured by the regime. Could you give us your list of 8 that you think would be captured?
There's 8% of countries worldwide, so I don't have all of the list in front of me, but it would be things like Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, other parts of West Africa where terrorist groups are controlling territory. So it's quite an extensive list at this point.
Okay, Ms. West, in terms of the list of countries, did you agree with that? Is that anything you want to add?
No, I would, especially on this, defer to Ms. Davis.
Okay, all right. Would either of the other two witnesses be interested in just responding to some of the points made with respect to the possibility of a humanitarian exemption, maybe which provides space and regulation for defining how that would be defined or not defined, but errs on the side of saying humanitarian activity, provided that efforts are made to minimize dollars to terrorist organizations, would be allowed?
Sure. I think it's the starting point here is that international humanitarian law already, gives the protection and already says that when you're operating in an area where there are armed groups, whether deemed terrorist or otherwise, even in situations where you might have to pay these sort of administrative fees or landing fees or whatever it might be, that kind of activity is authorized because the humanitarian imperative exists and we need to be able to respond to it.
Okay.
I would 100% agree with that. The idea that humanitarian assistance legally within, if you're going to provide a humanitarian exception based on consistency with international law, and then put domestic regulation on top of how you're interpreting international law, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If it's going to be lawful because it's lawful under international law, then that should be the limit.
Okay. Just in the time I have left, the definition of terrorist group in the criminal code, as I understand it, does not clearly exclude state actors. So some might argue that, for instance, Iran is a terrorist-controlled territory. Is it clear in the way the law is currently written whether or not it would apply in cases where the government of a state is not a listed entity but has the attributes of a terrorist group?
Very quickly.
I would say that the legislation would apply in those contexts, but then you're asking the humanitarian organizations to make that determination, which I think, as MSF mentioned, goes against their role to remain impartial and neutral.
Thank you, Chair. So it seems like one of the concerns about a general humanitarian exemption is the possibility of you have a terrorist organization controlling an area, and they say you can bring in humanitarian assistance, but you've got to pay 70% tax, right? So you're getting some money to people who are suffering, but most of the money is going to the government, to the authority. We probably wouldn't want quote unquote humanitarian assistance to go in that case because the price is simply too high in terms of who receives it. On the other hand, there would be other parameters and other circumstances where we would think that would be reasonable. So I'd like to hear from those that are in favor of a general humanitarian exemption. What you think would happen in the hypothetical case I've described, or should happen?
So what would happen in the hypothetical case where an exorbitantly high demand for taxation? Is that your question? Yeah. Look, MSF and another humanitarian organization, we've been doing this for 52 years now, in all sorts of contexts where armed actors are present and operating. It is part of our job, and it is consistent with providing aid to people who need it most, that we're constantly negotiating with these armed groups in a way that minimizes, the figures that you're talking about are not figures that we would ever agree to. We're constantly negotiating to the least amount of any sort of benefit whatsoever that's going to accrue to an armed group. By far, the majority of what we provide goes to the people that we're there to assist.
So just to follow up on that, you're a trusted, credible organization, and so saying, hey, we know what we're doing here is reasonable in your case. A broad humanitarian exemption wouldn't just apply to organizations like yours. It would apply to organizations that maybe have good intentions but don't have the same track record. So how, if we want to say yes to you in that case but want to be cautious about others that may not have the same experience, how do we do that?
Again, this comes back to what Claude was saying, and I'm sure she can build on this. She's clearly saying that an organization that is operating according to the humanitarian principles and providing aid impartially has the protection of IHL and already has then the right to intervene and to provide that service.